Welcome to The Side Quest, a weekly show on the GrepBeat Podcast where we interview interesting people adding to the North Carolina startup community. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Hello again. This is the week of June 16th, 2026. You're on the GrepBeat Podcast with The Side Quest Show. My name, as always, is Joe Colopy. I am the GrepBeat Godfather. And it's a slightly cooler day in Durham, North Carolina. My guest this week is none other than Jeff Welch of Duke New Ventures, and we're going to spend the next 20-ish minutes or so learning about him and what Duke is doing and Duke New Ventures and everything in between. So let's just get started. Jeff, how's it going?
It's going well, Joe. I mean, I sort of feel like I need to start with a question like, is the GrepBeat crowd Hurricanes fans?
Oh, I think some of us are. I was just thinking the other day of that. It's been such an exciting, last week for sports, right? I mean, between that and the Knicks and now the World Cup. I had some friends who went to the Spain Cape Verde match the other day in Atlanta for the World Cup, and it's just man, what an exciting week! But I'm not really a sports fan, even though I'm wearing a baseball cap. I mean, I enjoy those things and I'm kind of around. I'm glad that they happen and exciting, but I'm not really a follower of any particular teams, other than I do like March Madness. But other than that,
that would fit with the local flavor. But you don't bring this thing like that home every year. In fact, it's turning out to be once every 20 years for the Triangle. So we were watching, we were excited about it.
That is so. Just to kind of get into that, Jeff, let's talk about your first, what are you doing today? Right. Obviously, reviewing your background, there is a lot of Duke in there, but I want to talk about a little bit more about what you're doing today. And then we'll kind of walk back in terms of how, where you're from and how you kind of got to that place. But I think just starting with the basics so people even know who's this Jeff guy and what is Duke New Ventures and what does that mean? That'd be a great place to start.
Yeah, no, totally. So first of all, thanks for the invitation to be on the show and
sure.
Thanks for the question. So Duke New Ventures is sort of 1/4 of the tech transfer office at Duke. And the 4 divisions, which we can probably talk about more later, there's traditional patenting and licensing. There's an operations group that deals with cash flow and document management. There's the angel network called Duke Capital Partners, which you've probably heard of.
Yeah.
And there's our group, which is Duke New Ventures. And so our group is, you can kind of think of us as a sort of a mini LEK or mini ECG that works on behalf of technical founders inside Duke when they think they have something that's commercializable. And one likely outcome of that would be to do a startup company. So our group employs, its efforts to work with scientists, clinicians, engineers, often first-timers who haven't commercialized something out of their work before, try to put a good business foundation underneath how do we do product development? How would we create a company? Things like that. And so by nature, all the people on our team are really commercial people. So, most of them have been inside large companies for 20 or 25 years. Half of them have been CEOs of startup companies. They're really, really familiar with how product development works. And they're people who like product development and they like new market creation, which sometimes inside large companies are things you want to shy away from because they're really risky. But these are folks who've not only done that, but they're very happy to go down into the basement of a lab or over to a clinic at the hospital and talk to people about their ideas and see if we can basically provide advice on how to get something started, how to get a product development going, and how that might eventually fit into a startup company, or if not into a startup company, can we make contacts with others in the industrial world that might have some way of bringing that innovation to market?
So many questions. I actually find this topic fascinating. So I understand correctly. These are folks. This is kind of before the spin out or the licensing or whatever. It's kind of prepping them for that from, folks, these particularly scientists and other very technical people. It's kind of, I won't say the bowels, but basically the bowels of Duke, and connecting the dots, kind of bring that business framework, if it makes sense, to outside party or an independent party? And is that roughly reiterating it?
It's a great question. So like really, where in all that process do we operate? And the truth is, we operate across all of it, Joe. So the best thing for a group like ours, and groups like ours in the university world are, kind of really only maybe 10, 12 years old. I mean, this group at Duke, I was not the one who started it. My boss, Rob Razor, started it with a good friend of mine, Rob Halford, maybe a couple of years.
Yeah, Rob Halford, just to take a little impromptu spin. This is my second house in Trinity Park, which is next to Duke East campus. My first one, which I moved about 10 years ago, but like the later years, Rob was my neighbor.
Yes, not making any barbecues at Rob's house. So it's awesome. But these groups are relatively young, and so I think at different institutions you'll find they do different things. But for us, we'll start anywhere, but as early as possible is the best.
Okay.
Right? And because if somebody wins a 5-year grant and they think they might want to commercialize something out of that grant, even though they might not come all the way into our program and maybe be able to make use of everything that we can offer, if we can give a little bit of thought process at the beginning about some sort of business and commercial realities, then they can have that conversation, have that in their mind, and they come back to us, in a year or two or whatever. But one of the most common problems in university startups in regions that don't have a giant venture economy with sort of venture capitalists crawling all over themselves in the hallways of universities is it's really easy to screw up something on the business and you'll never know if you're
structurally they just legally do something weird
to avoid early terminal degradation the project due to the business reasons, but we carry it all the way through, and we sort of graduate a project when it's got enough money to meet a first value creation milestone, and it's got somebody involved who's going to run it outside the university, right? So that depending on the industry, regulated and unregulated industries can be really different, but usually that takes the form of a CEO or something, and then if it's a first time CEO, we'll sort of work with that person as our last thing to say, okay, well, do you have the board set up? How do you think about making your board work for you? How do you run a board meeting? How do you set up a calendar of board meetings? How do you put together a deck for your board? And then that's kind of it, right? And then once there's a board and a CEO in place, of course, they should be doing all the strategizing and procurement advice and so forth. And so we work across that whole gamut, which depending on, it's all early. And it's just how early are you really talking, right?
So, it is earlier on. You mentioned BCG and management consultants. It is kind of a spin out management consultants for it seems that type of skill set. So, to make the difference between tech transfer, when I think tech transfer, is that a little bit more transactional, a little bit more of a legal activity where you all are kind of like the business management consultants kind of around all of it? Because certainly that could be a part of it, but it sounds like you all take a more holistic view, and it needs a more holistic view versus literally the tech legalese around the tech transfer part of it.
No, it's a really good questioning, and transfer offices in general have evolved really dramatically over the course of my career, because I was on the other side of the table with tech transfer office at Duke when I was a graduate student. And it was an unpleasant experience.
We are recording this.
It was extremely transactional.
Yeah.
When the Duke Tech Transfer Office was challenged, right, for lack of a better way to put it. And of course, like in my capacity on this podcast, I'm not speaking on behalf of Duke or NC State or any other institutions. I'm just speaking personally, but one of the reasons I took this role when Rob reached out after he left this role during COVID was, I had some interest in the university getting a little bit better at some of these things, right? And don't get me wrong, I mean, the tech transfer office has come a long, long way since I left the university, 20-some years ago. Robin had built this much larger structure, and it was working well. But I think there's still oftentimes a lot of room for commercial and business and product development thinking in these early stages, which is the place where most people in a university don't receive any training or knowledge or experience, right? I mean, sort of by definition, those are outside the 501c3 concept, whether you're in the university or in the university's hospital system. And so I was excited to, try to, put a little bit of a dent in that. But to answer your question, most people think about tech transfer as the licensing, patenting and licensing function in the university. And those activities are almost statutory based on the passage of the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980, right?
Okay.
And so,
I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah. So if I asked you, Joe, if I said, Joe, what do universities do? Right? 15 seconds. What do universities do?
I would think they educate, students for the next level for professional life and academic life. I also think the reality is they're major research institutions to advance science and thought throughout the world. How's that sound?
That's really good. I would say honestly, like that's a. And I think that would.
Yeah, I didn't even type in ChatGPT. I should show my hands when I do that.
With what I think most Americans who went to college think of institutional, it's universities. But the reality in today's world is that universities have become so complicated, and they do everything from negotiating major sports television contracts to running huge health systems to running, for example, these tech transfer offices, which again are sort of in the case of universities, sort of a statutory thing. If you go back to 1980, just to give a little bit of historical context for your listeners, when someone received a government grant and some intellectual property was invented on that grant, whether it's patents or know-how or whatever, if you wanted to use that sort of business, you had to go directly to the government to license that intellectual property. So
wow.
I was not doing business or licensing in 1980, but I think the general consensus is that working with the government was almost impossible, right? I mean, it was very, very difficult. And there's a lot of political pressure when doing those licenses in the government to do non-exclusive licenses. And non-exclusive licensing, rarely works well to set up a new startup business, because if you do a ton of work, get your business off the ground, and then someone else is enabled with that same intellectual property to just be your competitor after you've sort of pioneered the market and figured out how to product market fit and everything else. Not a lot of people want to take that risk only to have their competitors be enabled. So the Bayh-Dole Act passed in 1980 made it so that if you received a government grant to do research or work or what have you, the recipient of that grant, which for our purposes inside universities is the university itself, was now the owner of the intellectual property. And if you wanted that intellectual property, you had to go to the university.
Versus the government.
Yes. Versus.
Got it.
So in some ways, like universities have replaced the government when it comes to the licensing and patenting function.
It's interesting.
Based on things that were developed, with some aspect of government grants involved, which of course is a huge amount. That's like
you know what? This is a little bit of a weird thread, but way back in the day, it all happened in the 80s. I used to tinker a lot with bulletin board systems that were kind of like pre-commercial internet. And then in 1992, this is, I think, Al Gore claims he invented the internet. I believe it was him who kind of signed something, or Bill Clinton did, that basically said, hey, it can now be commercial. And then after that, it didn't take long for like Netscape and Yahoo, all these things kind of like pop out of it, even though it had actually started as a military and academic project, right? These things. And so what's interesting is I don't think people understand is how there are these government changes that have real effects that they're kind of nuanced if you're not in that space, but it plays out a few years later and certainly multiplies decades later. That has huge effects in terms of how innovative as a culture we are, and also kind of ties into how these very large companies that are dominant today were really not just born, but how they were enabled to be born, right? So this one, I wasn't familiar with that, but that probably radically changed, the spin out culture from universities, these particularly large biotechs, a lot of life sciences things that are now industry titans. And I didn't know. I never connected the dots on that.
That's spot on, Joe. And I think it's hard to imagine, but university tech transfer, followed very immediately, of course, by venture capital and the style in which financing is deployed to early stage technology-based companies. Those systems and innovations, somewhat government, somewhat financial, are super critical to what has become the American economy over the last 50 years. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And the folks who got good at it early developed, sort of behemoth venture-based economies, and that has been super important. And one of the reasons some of those economies, have risen in certain places is that there were certain universities that had tech transfer or licensing offices before the Bayh-Dole Act, oftentimes to get rid of technology that was developed during World War II. And so, venture capital and so forth got a little bit of an earlier start in some of those places. It's not the only reason that venture economies grew up in those places, but, MIT is a perfect example of that. They had a longer history than just the Bayh-Dole Act, and many universities did not want to be in the licensing business, right? I mean, if you go back 45 years, universities' missions were, I think, objectively much simpler, right? And they viewed themselves exactly as you just described them. And doing, sort of being mandated to do commercial activity was not something they really wanted to do.
Yeah, almost allergic to it. So I have a kind of a question that comes up. So back in the day, 20, 25 years ago, right, when I was kind of more recent MBA student kind of rolling around, there's always a lot of chatter about Silicon Valley, the Bay Area's got it figured out because Stanford figured out tech transfer, and they're doing something very different than everyone, or better, or whatever. And everyone else, then it wasn't as extreme, but everyone else doesn't have it figured out, right? And it was a very one of those correlation causation kind of problems where people are like, look at all the stuff around Bay Area, look at the lack of stuff around here. This is how Stanford does its tech transfer, not even knowing how everyone else does it. Whatever they do, they've got the magic sauce, and why doesn't anyone else figure it out? So, and then the general vibe was all the other universities, at least around here, are just way too conservative, or maybe they just hold on to it too much, and they kind of suffocate maybe what could ultimately be some very large businesses, because I think everyone recognized that there is some great, research that is happening in this area, but for some reason it didn't quite translate in the same way. Is that true? Is that a fair statement? As things change, or how do you look at that more in maybe a nuanced way compared to the simplistic vibe that I heard 25 years ago?
No, it's a great question. I think in today's world, so 45 plus years on from the Bayh-Dole Act, the advantage of one tech transfer office over another at the top 30 institutions is pragmatically zero, right? Yeah. All these institutions the tech transfer offices are much larger. They cover much more territory. They do a lot better job working with, first-time entrepreneurs as well as late-stage entrepreneurs. And so really in today's world, it's about inbound money and interest. And then, outbound sales is never a strength of almost any.
Kind of the local venture market? Is it what you mean, regional venture market?
Yeah. So yeah, it really comes down to in today's world versus, say, if you cut a halfway point, maybe 20 years ago, the local tech transfer offices, the universities maybe still didn't totally want to be in the business, but they recognized that the large pharmaceutical company or a large maybe electrical engineering company came to a university, licensed some intellectual property sort of straight out of a lab, really early on, and developed it soup to nuts in-house, and the university had royalty on that. That could be pretty cool, right? Now you're making money. So I think, that world has gradually gone away in favor of what you just said, which is the venture capital community. And why is that? So large companies, in today's world, the CEOs and CFOs of those companies, particularly public companies, are under such pressure for quarterly earnings and everything else that adding on to their R&D expense and lowering their operating margin by taking on really early stage R&D projects is out of favor and has been for a while. And so those companies are much more likely to overpay, for lack of a better way to put it, for a successful venture-backed company or otherwise finance company that has de-risked.
So they buy versus build.
Yeah, and for obvious reasons. I mean, if you overpay for something in one quarter, by the next quarter, the Wall Street analysts have completely forgotten about it, right?
Yeah.
They'll roast you when you buy the company.
Oh yeah. No, it's crazy. It's as if they have the reports like, oh, that's a one-time expense. Oh, okay. Still money.
That has driven a tremendous amount of university licensing into smaller sort of companies, which is one of the reasons that groups like UCSF and Columbia and Michigan's where Rod Razor came from Duke, who now runs the Duke section, came from. That's why they started these kind of little venture groups like I run, which we're describing as kind of a mini consulting group inside the university. And so, but that's not the primary reason I think why those areas are where they are. I think the tech transfer component and the fact that some of those licensing offices preceded the Bayh-Dole Act and the universities were acclimatized to it, it was important 45 or 50 years ago. But just as important were there were presidents of those universities who were very, very industry friendly and wanted their universities involved with industry. I can't remember the person at Stanford, but Carl Compton at MIT and others really wanted to be involved with industry, wanted their faculty working with industry. And conflict of interest was a different era back then, right? So they would let faculty members sort of work part-time at the university and work part-time at their company and figure it all out, and nobody really cared. In today's world, that's much, much harder.
Reminds me of the John Doerr. He's the famous Clam Perkins venture capitalist. He had a quip that says something like, "No conflict, no interest."
That's right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. The other thing that's very important about those areas, and I don't think of failing of the southeastern states or the triangle, it's just the reality is this is not a traditional money center. Right. So Boston and New York and San Francisco already had investment cultures. And some of those, of course, a portion of those investment cultures were very risk tolerant. And as more and more risk tolerant investments have paid off over the last 50 years, those chunks of financial economies in those places have grown disproportionately. And they sort of have very high risk tolerance. And so you have very big venture capital and other smaller ecosystems. And that really is one of the biggest challenges for the triangle, because as that consolidates, and the venture capital firms are now bigger. I mean, they used to be sort of garden variety, everybody do the same thing.
They're massive.
$3, $5, $10 million rounds. Now, as the larger firms, you mentioned biopharma, so Arch and Flagship are two large venture capital firms. Both of their last two funds in with those are $3 billion. Right? But you can't dispersing that $3 and $5 million chunks, right? That doesn't work.
Yeah, it's just a different world.
That system is the triangle needs to find a way to overcome the fact that there's not a lot of risk tolerant capital here, and the innovations that do get built at places like UNC and Duke and NC State and Vanderbilt, Emory, and whatever, often you're really, really struggling to access the capital markets, because if we took early stage biotech as an example, 2/3 of the money invested by Boston and the San Francisco-based venture capital firms goes into Boston's air system.
Yeah.
Right? Everybody else is fighting for a third. And if you look at a couple other big cities like New York, San Diego, New Jersey, you gotta grow your own capital is the message.
Yeah. No,
that is kind of long spiel that was.
No, it's definitely, I think, us not being a financial center ripples through a lot of ways. We see a lot with even the local venture capital funds. Everyone's fighting after the same relatively small limited partners. No, none of these funds have gotten much beyond that unless there's some very real access to capital that is outside the area. Hey, so just a bit of a transition, and we're up. There are folks who listen to this and watch this who are like, "That's cool. Like, I want to be like Jeff," or like, "I want to get more into that space." So to help us understand, where do you come from? Like, where did you come from? And then maybe a little bit of following trajectory in terms of how you got to where you are now.
No, it's a great. Well, I appreciate the chance to offer my diagram. So I started life as a scientist. right? So
Are you from the Triangle area or?
I'm in Colorado, actually. And I came to school to go to Duke.
Sure.
And I had a really great experience at Duke. But I didn't come to Duke prepared, like, for example, my freshman roommate had gone to East Coast boarding schools and was really well prepared for Duke. I was more like, whoa, man, this is quite
in Colorado.
So I explored a lot of things at Duke, which was great. And I eventually decided I like science and was trying to decide between going to medical school or going to graduate school in the biological sciences. And I had applied to medical school and then I gotten waitlisted. But I also met my wife, now wife, or girlfriend at the time, who was already a physician. And it was like, I don't know, do we really need two physicians in the family? But do I want to stick around and wait on this wait list, or do I want to wait another whole year to apply? And I was sort of young and in a rush, and so I was like, they want me in grad school, let's go to grad school. So I was already doing research in the Department of Neurobiology at Duke, and I also entered their PhD program, which was very strong at the time, and had a great experience. And I started grad school expecting I would run an academic lab. I mean, I like science. I continue to love science, but I started grad school single, living in an apartment, and I finished grad school married with a mortgage and one child and another child on the way. And I decided maybe postdoc in Boston or San Francisco to hope that I could get an academic job down the road. It seemed like it was a sort of a weird time because NIH funding, a little bit like over the last year with the pressure from the new administration was flattening for a time, and that really favors already established professors versus established labs. And so, I were 5 years out, but I was sort of reading series maybe 2 or 3 years out, and I decided, all right, what am I going to do? So I was fortunate enough to go to a CED event. So we all know CED and love CED. I went to a CED event, and I met Richard Casey and Susan Casey, who were starting up Square One Bank. And I'm still not entirely sure how I did this, but somehow I convinced them that if they taught me how to do commercial banking, like I could maybe help them get into the life science business, because they were doing only tech and IT lending at that time. And so, long story short, and I was interviewing other things as well, like McKinsey and stuff as one does, and I was like, I was not really prepared for the business world. So somehow Sue and Richard took me on, and all that worked out, actually. So I learned a lot about business. I read financial statements all day for the better part of a year. Was in an analyst school with people who were 10 years younger than myself, and but I became a commercial banker at Square One Bank and ran the East Coast life sciences team for them. And then after a while, it was the 2008 financial crisis happened while I was at Square One, which was quite a learning experience. Like people are calling you and asking you if their money's safe. It gives you a really good understanding of what banks do. So it was a very interesting time. But we had all the transactions that we did there, which is, and to be clear, venture banking, which now I think a lot of people understand it because SVB had the trouble that they ran into 2 or 3 years ago. But back then, no one knew what it was. And Square One was the kind of largest competitor to SVB. But it's very high risk lending because you're lending to very small organizations with unstable revenue bases, or maybe no revenue if you're in the life science business and so forth. And so, fortunately, the companies I worked on there did really well, except for one. And that company was in RTP, and it was a drug discovery company that failed. And we had lent them, after they'd already raised like $100 million of venture capital, which was a lot back then. Lent them, I think, $1 million or $1.5 million or something. And it was super scary. Sue Casey was the chief credit officer, and she was in my office, like, pounding on the desk. And so I had set up an auction to auction off the assets, and I was hoping, man, maybe we can get like half this loan back. And I'm calculating like how much is loan that we lose, like what.
How much is this desk that I'm sitting at? That kind of thing.
Thinking like, oh my god, like this is terrible. Like, but we got. I have to say, very fortunate. A CRO on the West Coast came in and bought the business for effectively the price of the loan. And then a couple of years later, maybe a year later, they asked me if I would come back and run that business and help integrate it into their operations. So it was a chemistry CRO on the West Coast, and this was basically an early high throughput discovery platform. And I was looking for a new challenge. I said, sure. Was too early in my career to know that if anybody ever asked you to be the second person to integrate something, it's insane.
I like that. That's a word.
Yeah, so you can say no politely. You can run in the other direction, but you should definitely say no. So I did that for a year, and that's the closest I ever came to really being sort of an entrepreneur myself. It was a very hard time. I inherited 9 people out of 100 who just didn't know when to get off the bus, and that was my first general management experience. I wasn't very good at it, but we did okay. I mean, the other thing that was a challenge there for those younger folks there, I was brought in by an investor, but I worked for the CEO. Mm-hmm. Be really careful about whose goals are what in that mix.
They're not necessarily the same
in these small companies, and so. I think the investor wanted to monetize some of the intellectual property that was in the company, and the CEO was like, dude, we sell foreign services. You got to go out and sell foreign services. And so those were very different goals. I was probably more well-positioned to help with this. I was not well-positioned to help with that. What they really needed was a CRO salesperson who was really, really good, had a huge contact book, which I did not. We did bring in some good people. I brought in some good people. Actually, Rob Halford worked for me for a short time there. But I was not very good at it, and I left after a year. And so I was very fortunate to go on in corporate development in Smith & Nephew through a contact that I had met at Square One Bank. And Smith & Nephew is a large medical device company in the UK, orthopedics, and they had started a division here called Biologics Inspire. They had moved a division here called Biologics Inspire. So I got on the corporate development team there, and I was just thinking to myself, after kind of a couple of crazy years, at this point I had 3 young children. I was like, I just need a job. It's stable, so I can drive to soccer practice or whatever, And within 6 months of arriving at they're like, yeah, we're gonna spin the division out into a new company. I'm like,
great.
Let me tell you, it gets laid on when you start spinning things out. The corporate development people, right? So I'm like, oh, it's gonna be tough. Anyway, that actually didn't go through the first of it, but within a year and a half, we did spin the division out. I survived the division thanks to some very supportive managers. And ultimately, Bioventus grew up to reasonably well as a kind of company that fit in between medical device and pharma in the triangle. I was on the executive leadership team there as the head of corporate development for a little over 5 years, maybe almost 6 years. And then went through one of those things that one goes through in industry. There was the CEO I'd been working for and was really a great mentor to me and so forth. Decided to retire with uncanny time at the end of 2019, and so it was a very he did not tell the management team until kind of early 2020, and by that time we had just re-landscaped this huge thing. And during the course of 5 minutes, I should say that was another business education for me. I did a lot of M&A, I did a lot of licensing, I led venture capital deals. It was really a formative educational experience in the business of life science. And we had a couple of sales forces, and so learning how products really get sold at the end market and what it has to be, what the label has to be to make it so that the physician can make good use of it or wants to make good use of it. Just really learned a lot there. But we just saw this huge re-landscaping of the M&A landscape. We were trying to set up a new sports medicine division, or at least the CEO, and I thought that was a good idea. And we had done a small deal that I think was really going to turn into a good product in shoulder, and then we had proposed this couple other deals at the board meeting in March of 2020, right? And everybody was laughing about how people were going out and buying tubs of hand sanitizer and everything, and it was like within a week everything was shut down, right? And so, also unbeknownst to me, they were interviewing CEO candidates at that board meeting. So the board authorized a huge cross-border transaction at that meeting that they wanted me to do. Which I thought was a good idea. We've been working on it. We've done a small investment. It's been a 2-year thing. And they hired a new CEO in April. The guy he wanted to start early because the business was in a really weird state with COVID and everything, which totally made sense. But that was an awkward experience because it became very clear that he wanted to change the strategy of the company. I'd been working on the strategy of the company for 12 years. I thought it was fine. So we probably weren't going to be a great fit. And then I had this other. I knew this was going to happen, but he's like, why are we doing this transaction? And I'm like, well, the board wants to do a transaction. You have to talk to the board. If you don't want to do this transaction, I'm just in the middle, right? And so that was my second experience being in between the time with the board and the investors and the CEO. The board did want to do a transaction, and we ultimately, I did close the transaction, but then I left after that. He wanted to get his own person, which totally makes sense because he was switching his strategy.
And then did your Duke World Duke World restart, I should say.
Yeah, that was a very awkward time. I think you lived this a little bit the same way I did, but I had, at that point, I had teenagers who were in high school.
Yeah.
So small.
Yeah.
COVID, different public schools almost didn't meet for wasn't
yeah.
But not 2 years. It was definitely 3 semesters in school, and my oldest son was a junior in high school, and it was a challenging time for him living in a closet and also having good grades so you can go to college. And so I'll spare you all of the family dynamics. Got more of a sponsor teaching.
Yeah, well, it was kind of a surreal time. So, Jim, I feel like there are many more beers beers that we could have, and I would love to kind of talk through it. And it sounds like our kids are kind of like a similar place and maybe even similar schools, actually. But I do want to thank you for this kind of wonderful conversation that we've had, and really appreciate you kind of joining the show. And we'll definitely, I think just all of it is just fascinating. I think really getting into the nuances of what Duke Ventures is doing and tech transfer and all that. And I think also very interesting how I get a lot of folks who ask oh, how do I become a VC, or how to become this, or how to become that? It's they're young. It's really just know your stuff, build something, or actually kind of know your field first of whatever you're going to service versus just jump into it, because, you're not going to be that useful and helpful unless you really have some really deep knowledge in terms of that actual space. At least I found that helpful, and it sounds like you have.
I think that's great advice, Joe. So there's a lot to the commercialization arm of universities, which is just a little teeny tiny part of universities do. So sorry if we ran on for a while, but
good.
Really appreciate the invite.
We're here to educate. Jeff, it was wonderful having you on. Thank you so much. And I will kind of see you around Duke campus in the Triangle.
That sounds awesome. Thank you, Joe.
Cheers. Thanks for joining. Be sure to follow us through your favorite podcast platform. Now get back to working on your side quest